Let's talk about spies. The story in the Torah is that before the Jews were going to enter the land of Israel, they suggested sending spies. Moshe asked God whether they should or should not send spies, and God's answer was, I'm not telling you to send spies. If you do it on your own. And Moshe sent spies. He chose the leaders of the tribes and gave them the mission to go to the land, see what it's like. Are the cities fortified? Are the soldiers strong? Etc., etc. The things that a spy is supposed to report back on. They came back, and 10 out of 12 gave a negative report. They said, we can't go. These cities cannot be captured. 31 kings lived in Canaan land at the time. The cities, they said, were fortified with walls that reached up into the heavens. The people who lived there were giants, made us feel like grasshoppers. And it's impossible. It can't be done. The people were all disappointed, disillusioned, and they cried that night in their tents, the Torah says. And God was annoyed and said, now you're crying for nothing, but I will give you a reason to cry. And that night was the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Many years later, Tisha B'Av would become the day in which the temple that Solomon built, the first Beis HaMikdash, would be destroyed. And then years after that, the second temple would be destroyed on the same night, on the night of Tisha B'Av. So it is a night for crying, a night of mourning. But then, the first time, when the people cried, there was no reason to cry. God was angry with the spies. Moshe was angry with the spies. And it's one of the most tragic stories in the Torah. Now, this needs a lot of explaining. First of all, God says to Moshe, I'm not telling you to send spies. It's up to you. Do it if you want. It's surprising that Moshe would then go ahead and send spies. Moshe lived his life devoted to serving God, to taking instructions from God. That's why he consulted with God. He came to God and asked, should we or shouldn't we? What is your will? What is it you want us to do? And God says, I don't want you to send spies, but if you want to, you go ahead. It's surprising that Moshe would do it under those circumstances. But then once he did do that, why is everybody angry at the spies and not at Moshe? If sending the spies was not a good idea, if it was a mistake, then it was Moshe's mistake. Also, when you send spies, you want them to come back with a report to tell you what the situation is, to make an evaluation. They came back, they gave a report, they made an evaluation, and everybody's angry at them. Nowhere in Torah does it suggest that their report was false or erroneous or misleading. Nowhere does it say that they were exaggerating and that they hadn't seen what they claimed to see. So it was an honest report. It was a factual report. It was all correct. So what did they do wrong? Where is their sin? They were sent to spy, and they spied. The simple answer is, when you send spies, when an army sends out scouts to spy out the enemy territory, it is the spy's mission and job to find the most effective, the most efficient, and the most successful way to pursue the battle, to win the war. If spies come back and say, we shouldn't be in this battle and we are not going to win the war, then they are demoralizing the army and they're interfering with the victory of battle. That was not their job. Their job is to find the best way to continue. It is never their role to decide whether or not the battle should be fought. The same is true with commandments. When God gives us a commandment, there is no question, there's no room for doubt or for hesitation. What we are told to do, that's what we're going to do. God said, go into the land and inherit it. Make it yours. Conquer the land. There was no questioning that. That was never up for discussion. It's not debatable. It's not negotiable. We're going to do the mitzvah. We're going to be what God wants us to be. We're going to do what God wants us to do. Why then spies? Well, when you do a mitzvah, you can do it in so many different ways, with so many different approaches, attitudes, feelings. What is the best way? What's the nicest way? What is the most perfect way to pursue this mitzvah? But whether we're going to pursue it, that is not the question. So the spies that go out and decide whether or not the mission should be pursued, those are the bad spies. The good spies are the ones who come back and say, it's got to be done. I think we should do it this way. Here's the best approach. This is the easiest path to get us to where we need to be. So with every mitzvah, we have a commitment to doing the mitzvah that is not negotiable, that is pure, unadulterated devotion and faith, that if God says to do something, it is possible, it will happen, and we're going to do it. But along with that, we should approach every mitzvah thoughtfully. We can all give charity. What's the best way for us, for each individual? We're all going to keep Shabbos. What are we going to do on Shabbos? How are we going to make our Shabbos the most meaningful, the most beautiful, etc.? That's what the spies are for. When God said, I'm not telling you to send spies, you do it, you decide, Moshe didn't hesitate because he understood what God was saying. It's not that God was disinterested in sending of the spies. What God was saying is, I give you the commandment, and that you must obey. But when it comes to approaching the mitzvah, this is your job. You do it. I want to see you invest something in the mitzvah from yourself. I'm not commanding you to do it. This is not something you do obediently. This is something you do voluntarily of your own and from yourself. In fact, God does this to us many times in history. He leads us to a certain place. He brings us to a border, to a threshold. He brings us to where we need to be. And then when we're about to do the deed itself, the mitzvah itself, then God says, I'm not telling you any more. I'm not pushing you any further. Now, if you're going to go, make it voluntary. Now you decide. And that's true of everything in life. Our freedom of choice comes after God has already predetermined, prearranged, and set up a context, circumstances in which we find ourselves, which was not of our own choosing and not of our own doing, even if we think it was. We find ourselves in a certain situation. God put us there through a sequence, a complicated, long sequence of events that led to my being here and your being there. And now that God has brought us to this point, now there's a mitzvah waiting to be performed. And now God says, that's it. It's up to you now. Now your freedom of choice kicks in. Now it's your decision. Now it's your move. I've brought you to where you need to be. Now do what you need to do, but do it on your own. God gives us a commandment and then tells us we have freedom of choice. Oh, what does that mean? It means that there are no options. A commandment means this is what you have to do, not something else. There is nothing else. This is what you have to do. Thou shalt not steal. That's the truth. That's right. That's the way it needs to be. There's no negotiating that. There is no arguing that. You can't find an excuse or a reason or a justification for stealing, because there is none. The commandment is thou shalt not. End of subject. No spying when it comes to that. So when we start to negotiate with God about commandments, we are the bad spies. God says thou shalt not murder, and we start to reason with that. But certain people need to be murdered. Certain people need killing. What about people who are inferior? What about people who are... There's no negotiating that. There is no murder. There is no killing. That is not negotiable, and no spy was ever hired or chosen for that task. However, after God has given us the commandment, which means there is no negotiating this, then God says, and now you have freedom of choice. So the freedom of choice means you can either do or not do. You can either fulfill or violate. But that has to come from you. There, the spy is good. It's good that we're doing it on our own initiative. It's good that we have the freedom to go either way. Because then when we go the right way, we're bringing ourselves into the act. We're putting ourselves into what is good and holy and true. If we didn't have the freedom of choice, goodness and holiness would exist, but we wouldn't count. We wouldn't be part of it. The commandment would not only silence our opinion, but completely erase our existence. We wouldn't count at all. This is the truth, this is right, this is as it should be, and you have no input, you have no value that you can bring to the mitzvah, to the commandment. But when God says, this is my commandment, and you have freedom of choice, that's telling us two things. There's no spying on the mitzvah. There's no spying on a commandment. You don't try to out-argue God's decrees. But when you're doing what God says, when you are fulfilling the commandment, you're bringing yourself to it because you have freedom of choice. So when it came time to actually enter the promised land, God says, don't ask me what to do. I've told you what to do. Now the freedom of choice kicks in. Now it's your move. You decide how you're going to do it. The spies made a mistake, and they thought that it was up to them to decide whether they were going to do it. And that's never right. But there's another thing about this whole spy business. Why send spies if everything that the Jews needed was coming from heaven? They came out of Egypt without any effort on their part. God brought all the plagues. God disheartened the Egyptians. God drove them to despair until they had to give in and let the Jews go. Then when the Jews are caught between the army, the Egyptian army, and the sea, God splits the sea. Now they're out in a desert. They have nothing to eat. Food falls from heaven. They're thirsty. Water comes from a rock. People who are that pampered, people who have all their needs taken care of, why would they even think of sending spies? God said go into the desert, and He provided everything. Now God says go into the land. Rely on God. He'll give you the land. What do you need to spy for? What is this information going to do for you when you don't have to do anything at all except follow? God is doing it all. Here's what happened. The Jews, having experienced God's presence at Mount Sinai, having spoken to God face to face, were in a completely spiritual state of mind. And even their lifestyle was totally spiritual. When you have food from heaven, your life is very spiritual. Now God says to them, go into the land. Which meant, until now, I've been doing everything. This has been a miraculous existence. You're living on a level, on a plane of existence where the laws of nature just don't count anymore. Everything is supernatural. But that's going to end. Go into the land and start living by the laws of nature. The Jews at that time righteously, religiously objected to going into the land. When the spies came back and they said, the land devours its inhabitants. What they meant to say was, living in nature, living on land, devours the inhabitants. It's all consuming. You start living by the land, you start living in the land, you're going to go into Israel and become a farmer and a soldier and a carpenter. You're going to lose everything you gained. Judaism will be over. It's finished. You cannot live on earth and be heavenly. You can't live on the land and be godly. They're incompatible. We have to stay in a desert. We have to keep getting food from heaven. That's what keeps us spiritual and godly. But once we go into the land, you'll be devoured. You'll be so distracted. You'll be so caught up in earthiness, in land kinds of things, that Judaism simply doesn't have a chance. So they claimed, with all sincere and righteous intention, they claimed that going into the land would be a spiritual suicide. Only 2 of the 12 spies gave a positive report. They said, it's a piece of cake. It's our bread, to be literal. It's our bread. It's not that the land will devour us. We will consume the land and turn it into something godly rather than have the land consume our godliness. It's good. God had come down to Mount Sinai, but the people weren't sure how far down did God come. They thought that being in a desert is far enough. They're human, they're physical, they're eating physical matzah, they're lighting physical candles, they're putting on physical tefillin. Enough. Physical enough. If we go any further, spiritual suicide. But Yehoshua and Kalev, they said, not so. There's more. There's more godliness the lower we go. The more earthy, the more we get into the land, the closer we get to this additional godliness, greater godliness that exists in the truly earthy levels of earth. So here's where the spiritual devotion of an earlier generation couldn't adjust to the progress of godliness becoming more and more earthy, more and more natural, more and more Mashiachdik. And when it comes to these transitions, here's where God says, now you have to make a decision. Because to become more earthy cannot happen miraculously. That's a contradiction in terms. So when we have to take another step towards earth, that step has to come from the earthy being, from the human being, from his own experience, opinion, and this personality. So God says, now you make a decision. You're going to come down to earth. It's got to be done in an earthy fashion, not by divine decree. So this challenge that presents itself every few generations, how earthy can godliness be? When are we committing spiritual suicide? There were people who felt that after the destruction of Europe after the destruction of the Jewish communities of Europe, coming to the West, coming to Canada, coming to the United States, is spiritual suicide. There isn't going to be any Judaism in Canada. There isn't going to be any Judaism in the United States. It's too earthy, too worldly, too secular. Godliness needs a certain protected environment. Godliness needs a ghetto. Godliness needs a holy land. That's where it can exist. That's where it thrives. But in earthiness, not a chance. Spiritual suicide. And of course our grandparents, great-grandparents, were horrified even at the thought of coming to the West. The Treifa Medina, a land that is by its very essence not kosher. Treif. Only the few who had the vision of Yehoshua and of Kalev could foresee that the West would in fact become not only the new home for Judaism, but in many ways a greater home for Judaism. So we need to appreciate the godliness that is earthy, the godliness that is truly down to earth, because that's the progression, that's the plan of history, that is where we're headed. When God has come down to Mount Sinai so thoroughly, so completely, that earth itself, that nature itself, reveals, surrenders the godliness that it contains, its capacity for godliness. Because in the final analysis, it's that godliness that God is after, that God desires, that God is waiting for, as we are waiting for it. So the spies went, and they checked out the land, and they came back and said, we are too spiritual to make that adjustment. Sometimes our spiritual desires, our spiritual personality can actually get in the way of performing a mitzvah. It's conceivable, although it would take some stretch of the imagination, it's conceivable that a person motivated by spiritual concern, by high-minded intention, could actually refuse to give charity to a hungry man because there are better things to do. It's good to suffer. Hunger makes a man out of you. Arguments that may make sense on some level, but inherently go against the commandment. The argument that we could get more out of Shabbos could be a more spiritual experience if we all brought our musical instruments and got together in the woods and enjoyed the glory of nature and music makes the soul soar. It could be a great spiritual experience, but then it's not Shabbos. So the story of the spies, spy versus spy, means that there's a good way of spying and there's a destructive way of spying. If we spy our part, if we check out the approach to the mitzvah, then we are the good spies. But we don't tamper with the mitzvah itself. Do the mitzvah as God wants it done and make it meaningful to yourself. It's not enough to simply obey with a dry and disinterested or dispassionate performance. It is also wrong, and certainly not enough, to be very passionate, interested, involved, committed, and experiencing deeply and greatly the glory, the beauty, the holiness, the meaningfulness of a mitzvah while not actually fulfilling the mitzvah. If a person were to sit down on the eve of Pesach before sunset and make a seder with the matzah and the moror and so on and so forth, and truly contemplate the exodus from Egypt and experience what we're supposed to experience, that God takes every one of us out of Egypt, that we are all free because God takes us out of Egypt. We could all easily be slaves and in bondage. God takes us out of the house of bondage. He takes us out of slavery and gives us our freedom. And a person can think about this deeply and actually experience that freedom with a rush of gratitude for God, with a great thankfulness that moves him deeply to the core of his soul. And he can sing out that thankfulness and that appreciation and that inspiration. And it's all really very intense and very powerful. But the sun hasn't set yet. It's not yet Pesach. Eating the matzah is not a mitzvah right now. Having a seder is not a mitzvah right now. This is not fulfilling God's needs. This is not providing him with what he wants. And that certainly is not enough. Not good enough. So we need both things. We go into the promised land. We will inherit the land. We will do exactly what God wants. And we will do it the way he wants it. But we will do it with our enthusiasm, with our involvement, with our appreciation. We will spy out the mitzvah, and then we will know how we can best perform and fulfill that mitzvah. So we have a combination of a divine decree and human excitement, human warmth and involvement. And that combination, that's what Torah is all about.
Shalom Aleichem. How are you? You know, I do a lot of talking, a lot of Zooming, many classes, many subjects, but that's all formal stuff. Hopefully good stuff, but formal. We also have a Wednesday night meeting that's more informal and kind of Hamish. If you want to join us for that kind of an event, interactive, time for questions and so on, if you want to join us for this side of conversation, click on the link below and join us every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. Well, maybe not every Wednesday night, but we try to make it every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock, a more informal chat, which can be more enjoyable at times than the formal stuff. So check it out. Click on the link and join us. Try it. You'll like it.